Education here at CPW. You're here for our Meet the Artist night. Every Thursday we host artists or artists, either visiting or local artists to talk about their process, to have conversations, to meet one another. So it's a really nice night to come out every week. We'll have someone. Tonight we're really lucky to have both of our artists in residence, Yael Malka and Allie Tsubota, and I'm going to let them get into it. But before that, I'm going to read your bios. Yael Malka is drawn to the idea of language, not only in the linguistic sense, but also in the ways people develop modes of communication through patterns of signs, symbols, and materials. She received her BFA in photography and a minor in art history from Pratt Institute. She was recently awarded the Aperture and Google Creators Grant and in 2021 received the 30 Photographers Award, which is given to 30 nominated photographers worldwide annually. Yael is currently working on a book about queer dancers set to be published by Chronicle Books in spring 2024. Her book, The Views, was recently acquired. Welcome. By MoMA. Wow. Solo shows include Where's the Invitation at the Leslie Lohman Museum and Almost Touching at the Rubber Factory. Yael is from the Bronx, New York, and now resides in Brooklyn, New York. She photographs commissions for publications like the New York Times, the New Yorker, Vogue, and the Atlantic. And since they'll be going back and forth, I'll read Allie's as well. Allie Tsubota is an artist exploring intersections of race, visuality, and the formation of historical memory. Her work joins photography, video, photographic and filmic archives, and text to examine the role of photographic spectatorship across racialized space in collapsed historical time. Tsubota has received recognitions from Aperture, Google's Creator Lab, the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago, and Silver Eye, among others, and has been an artist in residence with Headland Center for the Arts and Arcus Project in Japan. Her first solo exhibition was recently on view at Tilt Institute for Contemporary Image in Philadelphia. Tsubota holds an MFA in photography from Rhode Island School of Design. She presently teaches photography at Parsons School of Design in the College of New Jersey. Thank you, you two. Can we give them a warm welcome?
Do you want me to talk about what we're going to do?
Yeah, okay. Go for it.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Sarah. That was really kind. I'm so happy that we get to be here and share our work with you tonight. So we decided to do something that was a little less like artist talk from me, artist talk from Yael, and instead sort of put our work into conversation based on some overlapping themes and interests. And so what we have are three sort of thematic blocks that we've identified as shared interests between our practices. And we're each going to share a project or a practice or something, set of works that relate to those thematic blocks. So we'll be sort of switching to and from. But we do this as sort of like a practice in collaboration and as an effort to sort of like open our practices up to each other, but also to open them up generally and sort of animate them and keep them alive sort of in new ways. So we invite you to, be a part of this experiment with us. Turn over to Yael.
Hello. Thank you guys for coming. I'm really excited that we're doing this format and just to talk about the ways our practices overlap and intersect, even though they have very different perspectives and aesthetics. It's a fun exercise to think about the commonalities. I also want to thank CPW for having us here, and just like being given this time and space has been so invaluable to like, first of all, wake up in like a really beautiful and serene place and like do my morning pages on the porch. And then just like work all day long and only have that as that's like my only obligation. And that feels really special. And I feel really privileged for that. So thank you. Okay. So we're going to show three separate projects. And like we said, in three separate blocks or themes. So this first one is intimacy and desire. this project, the People's Beach, is one that I started actually through a commission that I got last summer by the New York Times, actually. And the commission was basically to, like, the editor called me, and the commission was basically to spend like the entire summer at the beach, like getting paid to take pictures at the beach. And like, that is a dream job for me as someone who loves the beach and the sun, but also especially because it was this beach, which is a really special place to me. It's been coined the People's Beach, but it's basically at like the far end of a boardwalk at Jacob Riis Beach in Queens, and it has become this like queer haven since like the 1940s. And the impetus for having me document the beach last summer in particular was because this building, which is the abandoned Neponset Hospital building, was going to be demolished, which it has since been demolished. And I think it's like a very big part of why the beach is what it is. Like, I think that when it was a functional hospital, it wasn't a place that people wanted to go. So the queers were like, we'll take that part of the beach. Like, that's for us. No one will bother us there. And so there was this like physical, like literal physical barrier that sort of divided the community there, which I think offered this sense of like safety and privacy, which is especially important for people whose bodies and sexuality has been like weaponized and politicized. So yeah, I think the story's aim was basically to create like a time capsule of Jacob Riis Beach, like as we've known it to be before it inevitably like transforms with the demolition of this building. And yeah, ultimately, at its core, I wanted to sort of capture the people who visit this beach, and also like the remnants of violence, but also like resistance that you can find along the landscape. It was a good time to get this project, I think, because I was already working a lot on projects that the themes were about like identity and community and queerness, and also like influx landscapes due to gentrification in New York. So also my connection to this beach, having gone for like over a decade and growing up in New York, I had this like, yeah, personal connection, which I think really helped to have like an intimate portrayal of the people there, and the relationship that I had to this place was, I think, like strengthened the photographs. And I also wanted this project to have a life beyond the New York Times project. It felt like it wasn't like the story that New York Times told was a different story than the one that I would have liked to tell. And while I was shooting there, I was thinking a lot about like what happens to a place that is constantly in flux like New York, and like what can be done with the remnants, and what can be done with a history that's been built there that is like slowly being erased. And yeah, I think when Allie and I were talking about the different themes in our work, this project talks to like speaks to skin and sexuality, and like I said, it's something that skin has been like weaponized throughout history, but Riis, I think, is a place where the weaponization of like either of those things almost ceases to exist in a way. And yeah, I think it's a place where bodies can just like be in themselves and not feel like harassed, or I mean, I think they're being seen mostly in the way that they want to be seen. There's definitely still like cops on horseback that roll up and kind of like disrupt the vibe, but that's inevitable. So that's some work from last summer. And then I started photographing, or this is actually, sorry, I'm still showing work from last summer. Also, there's a very conservative neighborhood that straddles the beach, and they have there's been many efforts to sort of stifle the queer beaches like movement, and there's literally like men staked out with like their 500mm lenses, like trying to photograph like any sort of like nudity or like sexual acts that they see. And it's so silly because they're like spending their time watching to be able to report this to like local authorities. But if they weren't waiting to see something, then they wouldn't see it, you know? Like, I think it's just like a way to sort of try and further erase the existence and experience of like a place that has been made mostly safe for queer folks. So this past spring, I started going to the beach weekly again to document this like soft demolition of the Neponset Beach Hospital. And yeah, the site I think is of like great importance, and with the imminent changes that are yet to come, like there's going to be like a pool and like a park and like a big parking lot that's going to be there next summer. I feel like documenting this change is important, and what's to come. I think inevitably it will affect the way the beach feels. Also, it's interesting because in 1955, Robert Moses, who was a very like evil city planner, like proposed raising the buildings and building like a pool, sports fields, and what else? And like extending the beach. And that's essentially what's happening now. So it's kind of crazy that like 70 years later, his plans are coming to fruition. And it's quite upsetting because I feel like he has done a lot to sort of like destroy and segregate communities in New York. And yeah, it seems like somebody just like maybe found his plan somewhere and was like, oh yeah, we should make this happen now. But yeah, I think it's also just like a site that's been highly contested, with like the stark contrast between like the queer community on the beach and then the highly conservative like neighborhood that like many police and firemen live in. And there's been a lot of like conversation between like politicians and like neighborhood committees about what's going to happen to this place. And yeah, I feel like the violence at the center of the building's slow erasure is inevitably intertwined with like the uninhibited joy and liberation, like tenderness and pleasure that comes from the beachgoers' experience is there. Like they're kind of, yeah, intertwined. And then when I was shooting, I mean, the more and more like the projects I've been working on recently, I feel have really benefited from delving into archives that exist of those places. And so while working on the Reese project last year, I was given access to this like amazing wealth of archival material. And it's just like decades worth of photographs that were made there that were really helpful to look at as I was photographing, and just to like see the things that have stayed the same, but also the ways that it's changed. like this is still a thing that happens. The cops on horseback. This was probably in like the 70s. It used to be a lot more nude then than it is now. The lifeguards are very like on it whenever they see anyone without bottoms on. But look at all these cute bathing suits. Like, yeah, just beautiful photos. I mean, that person on the left is like really serving. And that's the building when it was still in use. It used to be like a tuberculosis hospital, and then a hospital for World War II veterans, and then it, before its closure in 1998, it was a nursing home. And this is a picture from like 1971, and this is a photo of mine from 2018, and I just thought that was kind of like a fun little thing, a little moment that happened across many decades. So that's that project. Thank you. I'll let Allie come in.
So already I feel really excited about this format because just watching you present makes me realize that there's even more sort of like registers of or areas of overlap between these two projects. So I'm going to talk about a recent film work called Bather's Interior, and similarly to the People's Beach, it's very much concerned with the coexistence or concurrence of things like disappearance and desire, or erasure and longing and tenderness and violence, sort of like existing on a specific site together. So it's also, I mean, it comes from the archive and it also has to do with sand. So just like so much. I know. Okay, so this is a work, Bather's Interior. This is an install shot from the summer. It's a film that I made this past year, and it's essentially a recreation of a 1964, it's a recreation of a minor scene from a 1964 Japanese film directed by Hiroshi Teshigahara called Woman in the Dunes. Has anybody seen Woman in the Dunes? Yeah, yes. Yeah, so this is essentially, I mean, for some background on the film itself, it's a Sisyphean epic in which these two protagonists are living at the bottom of a sand dune together. And it's Sisyphean because each night they have to dig out the sand in order to prevent themselves from being like quite literally swallowed by the desert. So the scene that I've recreated is a bathing scene. And it's one of, it's one of several really sexually charged moments between the two protagonists in the film, but it's the only scene that introduces the visual language of bathing. And as it plays out in the movie, the scene starts in a really sort of mundane fashion, right? Like one of the characters needs a bath. They've been out shoveling sand all night and like want to be clean. And so the other protagonist draws a bath and begins to hand bathe them. And what happens slowly throughout this scene is it gradually moves from this sort of like mundane and ordinary act of care to something with sort of valences of sensuality and desire and longing. So I'm going to show an excerpt, and it's a little like clunky here just because I have to pull this down to get you where we need to go. So I'm going to show you an excerpt, and then I'll keep talking. So I'll keep playing, but I'll turn the sound down so I can just talk over it. Interesting, in the original film, there's a lot of visual play between sand and skin, and it's interesting to think about that also in relationship to the People's Beach. So in recreating this scene, I was really interested to think about skin, as this sort of permeable membrane or an interface between two subjects. I was also really interested to think about this act of bathing as an act of cleanliness, hygiene, purity, and of course it's visited upon the site of racialized skin. And so to me, this gestures towards racial purity, racial hygiene, right? Racial cleanliness. I was interested in the idea of bathing as a sort of distant metaphor for assimilation, in that this is an act of disappearance or erasure, but it's also an act that's suffused with immense longing and desire. And so I was hoping to sort of meditate on both of those, or like the potential contradiction of that together, disappearance and desire, as they are visited on the site of racialized skin. I'll also say that I was really interested in the sort of interplay, or the substitution and the replacement of subject positions between the two protagonists throughout the film. And so there's a sort of movement or a flow of subject position between subject and object, looker and looked, sort of spectator and seen. And it's important to me that each of these protagonists is sort of having different experiences of this single shared act. And I think we'll be able to watch the very end. That's it. Yeah. All right. Okay, so moving into the next.
Okay, so for this next project, I don't always make things that look like photographs. Not that I need to like only stick with photographic projects as my medium, but for this project, these don't. I don't think these do look. I think that these are photographic in that it's like using a record of something. So these are basically, over the last like 7 years, I've been collecting found paper from the streets of New York. Anything from like to-do lists to like children's homework to religious texts to drawings to like intimate notes between like friends or lovers. Those are like really exciting ones when I find those. And then like many just like esoterically written scribbles or like things with numbers that I try and discern for a very long time. But yeah, I think that these papers like on the surface might feel sort of like mundane and like simple in their quotidian nature, but I think that like they're relevant to larger conversations around like relationships and private versus public and consumption, and also like the way that we use language. And so, yeah, I kind of think of this project from like an anthropological perspective. And I think that like viewing these papers is part of like a larger sort of a cycle of collecting something, which was once discarded. Like it was something that was important to someone, then discarded, and then I found it, preserved it, and I'm like sharing it again. So I find that like cycle really satisfying. And I also love collecting. I love repetition. I love information and details. I am a Gemini, so it like feeds me. And yeah, I think I really just like love getting a peek into someone's life in a way that maybe I'm like not supposed to, or it's like questionable, because ultimately like are these supposed to be something I'm meant to see? I don't know, it's like put out into the world, discarded whether like intentionally or not, and then I sort of like give it a new life through collecting them. And these are actually like in a book, which I have. You can look later. But yeah, I think I'm also just like interested in like the day to day, because ultimately that's what makes up like the larger themes of life, and just like record keeping. I'm really obsessed with, and yeah, I think I'm like very drawn to micro aspects of a subject and like transforming the way that people normally engage with them, sort of by like recontextualizing the found material, to create sort of like a portrait of a time and a place. Okay, I'm going to be quiet for a little so that you guys can read these papers, because some of them are really special and funny. And like beautiful, like things that have just been like sitting in the rain for like however many days, and like the ink bleeds out and it's like a beautiful piece of work. I love this one. It's like an aerial view, I think, of this child's house. There's like the stove and the bed. People are sleeping in their beds. The window. I just like love this perspective. Yeah, this one's from 2013. I've been collecting for a long time. This one, start doing laundry. Do the dishes. Take a shower. Yeah, just like little views into someone's like very private life. And also these, which is like something I needed to like decode and figure out what it was. And those are like really fun moments. Yeah, because I think like working with found material is really exciting to me, because you're breaking down what it means, in relation to like the systems we function in when you use things that are like already existing. And yeah, I'm like interested in this tension, like I was saying earlier, of how like this ephemera from strangers almost becomes this like public record of a person's day, or like thought process, or way of like communicating or remembering something. And it's just like it brings up this question of like, when something's left behind, is it made public's property? Does it become communal? Is it trash until like somebody picks it up? And yeah, I think like it's interesting to think about the fact that this is a conversation between myself and the author without them knowing that we're having it, and like getting permission from them. So yeah, I think the authorship and ownership question around here gets like kind of slippery in a way that I find really interesting. This one's a real saga. Dear my old BFF. I don't know if you guys can read this, but you're gonna want to dig into this one. And like this, I'm like curious if that person ever received the letter or not, or if she just like wanted to vent and like get it out there. And then it ended up in my hands, and now I'm showing it to you guys. So I don't think that was her intention, but here we are. And yeah, I think just the way that like a paper that is been like degraded over time, or is like sitting on pebbles or dirt, or is engaging with like the elements, something like really beautiful happens to like the breakdown and degradation of the paper that I find exciting texturally. And it just shows like time. It's like the texture on the paper is like a passage of time. So good. And I'll hand it over to Ellie.
I was really excited to see when Yael showed me this project, because I'm sort of obsessed with this idea of messages and notes and their unintended recipients, and sort of like the lives of these things beyond their intentions. I gave a class of students I was teaching an assignment to go out and write a letter to someone who for whatever reason was not going to be able to receive the letter. And this one student came back after like 20 minutes and they were like, I was like, Chris, did you like write the letter? And they were like, no, if no one's going to read it, there was no point in me writing it. So I just didn't. I was like, wow, your logic is airtight and I can't argue with you. So anyway, this whole notion of like the impossible recipient or the unintended recipient was interesting to me in Yael's project. And it's also something that's important here. So I'm going to talk about a project. It's a sub-project called Letters to/from H, and it's part of a larger work called Dead Letter Room that I finished last year. And it starts with this figure. This is Hara Tamiki, who is a late Japanese poet and writer who's most famously celebrated for authoring Summer Flowers, which is a narrative first-person account of the bombing of Hiroshima. So Hara, he's born in 1905. He is he's known for his really slender output of poetry and prose during the pre-war and immediate post-war period. And then tragically, he dies by suicide in 1951, shortly after the war. And so Hara's literary archive is really full of themes of time, dreams, and the afterlife. And I became really infatuated with him when I started reading his work. And especially because he seemed to be very intentionally writing across a fractured sense of time and a fractured sense of space. Again, really potent in his literary archive, ideas of time, dreams, afterlife. And so then I became interested in sort of literature itself as a form of time travel, in that literature has this inherent ability to travel across time from its author to its recipient. And so I became really interested from that to think about the potential of reaching backwards across that bridge or that channel of time that is created through literature and its intended or unintended recipient, future recipient, and thinking about what forms of intimacy might become possible through that project. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this stuff, but what came of this is a fictional correspondence or fabulative, to sort of cite Saidiya Hartman's notion of critical fabulation, which is of course really important to this work. And it's a fictional correspondence written between myself and the personified remains of Hara Tamiki's literary archive. And I'm careful to say that it's between myself and the fictionalized or personified remains of his archive, and not between myself and between Hara, because of course I'm authoring both sides of the correspondence. So I wrote the correspondence. It's a series of 13 letters, and they're all penned in English, although about half of them have been translated into Japanese at this point. And I wrote them while I was in Japan, reading Hara's work, meeting with literary scholars who study him, visiting his physical and literary archives, and really exciting to me, actually meeting some of his family members. So one thing that I think is important to talk about in this work is the problematic of translation. And so Hara is a Japanese writer, and I am a native English speaker. I do not speak, read, or understand Japanese. And importantly, very few of Hara's works have actually been translated into English, with the exception of just a few short stories. And so largely, as I was writing this correspondence, I was relying on these illegitimate, sort of like bastardized translations of Hara's work. And to me, that actually feels really important, because I think working with these unauthorized translations heightens the act of mediation that is inherent to any act of translation, right? Language is a medium, translation is a medium, and this idea that meaning flows through language unchanged is like totally false. And so I couldn't access Hara's archive, right, in a direct sense. And so it needed to be mediated. And it feels important that that mediation is, again, heightened through this act of looking at unauthorized translations. So this is how the work is sort of becoming anew or iterating now, experimenting with some new installation strategies around layering and the text sort of interrupting itself. And then the last thing I really want to talk about as we go through these final slides is another question that I get often when I talk about this work, which is the ethics of speaking from or for someone else. And again, importantly, I'm speaking for someone else who is no longer alive. So this is a person who can no longer speak for themselves. And I'm speaking for someone else whose language I don't, again, read, speak, or understand. And so there's a lot of hesitation and consternation in engaging in this type of exercise in which I'm essentially putting words in somebody else's mouth. And so again, this is why I'm careful to say that the correspondence is between myself and a personified version of Hara Tamiki's literary archive. But at the same time, you know, one thing I tried to do was to be really sensitive about the tone of the letters. And so I do try to match the tone of, match the tone of Hara's writing. But as I was going through the process, I really quickly realized that there was never a chance that I was ever going to get it right? Like there was no perfect or accurate representation of Hara, just as there's no sort of infallible representation of history. And so in a sense, I felt like I was engaging in this fabulation as a way of mimicking or even mocking the project of writing history as itself, this project of fabrication, as involving fabrication as much as it involves a sort of sincere desire to record or to capture information. So I tell people that the work that I'm doing here is no different than the work that a historian does, but that's off the record. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so this is our last, both of our last projects that we're showing. Okay, so this is a project that I've been working on for like the last 6-7 years. Now that I'm 33, I'm noticing that I do tend to like work on long-term projects, like 6, 7, 8, 9 years. I think it's just like hard to decide when something is done. So I'm noticing now like there's many projects that I've been doing for a long time. And this is one of them. So the title of this work, Kinneret, is also the name of a place which was once a cooperative socialist community in Israel called a kibbutz. And the word kibbutz in Hebrew actually means group. I'm gonna show you some pictures from the archive from the kibbutz that my grandparents emigrated to from Morocco, and my dad grew up in, and I lived there when I was younger as well. So I've seen it through sort of like 3 different generations experiences there. So yeah, the story is not like about my family per se, but it's a place that I have access to because of my family, which, it's a really bizarre place. And so I just started photographing there, and then it became this like more cohesive project after many, many years. So basically the kibbutz movement started in the early 1900s, and it was basically it started when Jews were fleeing anti-Semitism and pogroms in Eastern Europe and moving to Palestine and starting these like cooperative, like utopian sort of experiments that were centered around like non-hierarchical living and agriculture. And yeah, I think their aim was to build, like I said, this like socialist utopia, one where all the meals were had communally, all children lived in one home together and were like brought up in the same exact way. Like all property was shared, money did not play a role in living there. And everything, like including the one car, was shared by everyone there. And that was where my dad grew up. And then I just want to show these quick. These are two photos from my own personal family archive. So the picture on the left is my grandpa, my dad, and older uncle. And then this is my dad, me, and my sister, like the same ages, in the same place, 40 years apart.
So which one is your dad on the left?
He's on the left side.
Oh,
Yeah. And then this is him like 40 years later. It's interesting because it seems like a really like tender, beautiful moment in this like tradition of like planting trees, but there's sort of like a violent act that's happening here, which I didn't know when I was younger and doing this, but I think it's interesting to have these photos. But these were taken in the Judean hills in Israel, which used to be like rich with olive trees planted by Palestinian farmers. And once the state of Israel was established in 1948, this non-for-profit organization, JNF, which stands for Jewish National Fund, was created, and their tagline was "Build a vibrant future for the land and people of Israel through bold initiatives and a Zionist education." And one of their biggest initiatives was planting trees in these areas that used to be Palestinian farmers' land. And not always planting trees that are like indigenous to those areas. So yeah, I think like in Palestine, the struggle for land cannot be extricated from the fight for agricultural and environmental rights, which is ironically also at the heart of the kibbutz movement, which I think is interesting. And yeah, I think whether I want it to be or not, this project is inherently political. So I thought it was important to have these images at the head of this project, which ultimately I think will be a book, like to display and examine the Zionist indoctrination that happens from a very young age. And also to talk about my pro-Palestinian views. I felt it was important to have in a book of photos made in Israel. So okay, now I'm just gonna go through these photos as I explain more about what happened to the kibbutz. Like over the course of like 80 years, it really shifted. Like fast forward to like the 1990s, and in enters capitalism to the kibbutz, and in response, the kibbutz privatized many aspects of life, and like the collectivity of this community that was once sacred was disrupted. People like drew individual salaries, and like nuclear families lived together and ate meals at home together. People owned their own property, and money started to be exchanged, and there was a hierarchy that then became developed, and it was like a capitalist community. And while like they're nearly recognizable today as like in their ideology, I feel like their history is very much etched onto the landscape, like the remnants of labor and the remnants of collectivity. And I don't know, just also like the agricultural aspect is still very present. And so, yeah, this project is kind of looking at the contradictions between this collective fantasy and its manifestation on this kibbutz. And I think it also looks at like the dualities of a single community, like homogeneity and individuality and like decay and innovation, and also destruction and also beauty. And yeah, over the course of the last like 6-7 years that I've been photographing this place, I started to do interviews with people who've like grown up there or currently live there, like ages like 14 to like 92, so that have experienced many different moments of the kibbutz. And there's a reflection from my uncle that I thought was really interesting. He said, "Socialism was just right for the time and gave us no pause to stop and think if we wanted to explore something else. We weren't ripened to think in terms of you and me. It was very comfortable to live as equals and to gather around the tribe's bonfire." And so, yeah, ultimately, I think this is a project that is, of course, cannot be extricated from the politicized land that it sits upon. But I was really wanting to focus on sort of like the ways people choose to live amongst one another, and sort of like the pros and cons of socialism and capitalism, which there are many to both. And it's just like interesting to have such an intimate insight to this place. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Maybe it's just me. I feel like this should be the only format for artist talks ever. Like, I'm having a great time. I don't know. Everybody else is probably like ready to go. But I really love it because, again, like, I feel like there's so much interesting overlap when you're thinking about different geographies and temporalities and archives. I mean, I love that photograph, the set of your dad and you now, because to me, that really speaks to the sort of like iterative nature of the archive and the sort of like the recurrence of histories, the recurrence of empire, the recurrence of establishment and disestablishment. So anyway, this is also a project that thinks about recurrence, not explicitly, but just sort of in the way that I learned as I was doing the research. It has to do with immigration archives, and I was looking specifically at early 1900s immigration archives of Chinese women. And I was making this work alongside a Mexican-American artist who was also thinking about immigration status or processes at the border today. And we found so many commonalities between the historical and contemporary sort of iterations of these processes. So anyway, this is a project called I Am Not Sand, They Told Me, and it is, I'm going to share parts of it. It's a multi-part work, and it's also very much in process. And I'm going to interject my own ramblings throughout, sort of like as they relate to this theme, which is the archive and homeland. So, okay, a few pieces. This project begins where many of my projects begin, which is on the National Archives website. And I was drawn to specifically the immigration archives of Chinese women who had arrived in San Francisco around the turn of the 20th century, so early 1900s. And importantly, and all of these women who I've picked out exist in this way, it was really common for Chinese women to be detained and or deported because of suspicions that they were arriving as prostitutes. And so in effect, this shows that this is a moment of really incredible anxiety, racial anxiety, and anxiety around the sexuality of Asian Americans and Asian women. It's also, interestingly, and this is why I show these photographs, one of the first times, if not the first time, that surveillance photos are used at the border to regulate a group of people in the United States. And so you have the racial anxiety of a changing national body alongside the arrival of photography as this sort of tool of surveillance. And both of those things are colliding on the site of Asian women's bodies, and specifically in this case, Chinese women's bodies. Okay, so one part of this project is a film. These are just stills from it, but I am going to show you about 4 minutes of it. Again, apologies for the clunkiness of this whole endeavor. And I'll say that in making the film, I was departing from this history, these sort of immigration cases and records, these early Chinese arrivals to the US. And I was thinking specifically about how the archive remembers and attempting to disorder that remembering by introducing new forms of knowledge. And so this part of the film, it's the sort of first 4 minutes, and it's introducing the story / remembering of these women's archival lives through the ecology, through the place itself of their arrival. So it's the North Bay of San Francisco. And I'm going to read the text because the voiceover is not yet complete. So you can listen to my voice instead. Theirs is a memory across centuries. Before the quake, before the fires, before the small feet of children peeled their bark with sandaled soles, there were seeds. Darkness. There were inverse, heart-shaped leaves that sprouted from the dampened kernels, inches above the ground, too slight and fragile to yet imagine, twisting skyward, 200 feet or more. There was the smell of eucalyptus and lye, their chemistry commingling to form slim deposits of salt. Like a sickly child, thin and yellow and nervous in their breathing. The seeds grew in unfamiliar earth, tall and lush beside the military fortress, beside cliff-dwelling cannons and the steely echoes of space made from speed, fear, and disfigured stone. They listened as they passed adolescence, amid deep silences broken only by the sounds of pissing soldiers and the midnight lovemaking of tree frogs. They faced the ocean. They saw steamships, cargo, and agile human bodies, long browned limbs with radiant smoothness, darkened eyes like miniature celestial globes. Even the trees know, as like memory, looking has to be learned. Okay, so excerpt. So the film goes on to tell the story of Ju Young, who, this is her. She was a Chinese woman who was actually born in San Francisco, and re-arrived to California around 1906. And again, she is detained and ultimately deported because they suspect her of being a prostitute. Immigration officials suspect her of being a prostitute. And what's really interesting to me about her case is that it hinges on this set of photographs. And so the photograph on the left is Ju Young at 4 or 5 years old when she leaves California to travel to Canton to visit her family. And the photograph on the right is Ju Young at 16 years old when she returns, right, 10 years later. So she leaves the United States, she stays in Canton, China for 10 years, and then she returns. She should be able to, right? She's a native born, so she should be able to return to the United States. And her case record is 100 pages long, and it's essentially immigration officials arguing back and forth around whether these two photographs depict the same person. Okay, what's next? Yeah, this is just screenshots from there. So on the whole, her record really evidences the sort of wild inconsistencies and contradictions that exist within immigration archives, and especially within these immigration procedures at the turn of the 19th century. The Chinese Exclusion Act is enacted, right? They have no idea how to police this thing. They're using photographs as a form of surveillance, right? None of this makes any sense. And so it's wildly inconsistent. And so I was thinking about, let's see. Sorry, I'm trying to follow my notes here. I haven't talked about this work. Okay, so what happens ultimately is they can't really decide, right, if this is the same girl, and they deport her. But what's interesting to me is that she sort of remains as an archival fugitive. She's sort of like, thank you. She is really incapable of being surveilled by the state. And so in creating these photographs, the state actually creates and evidences its own contradictions and its own inconsistencies, and they create the possibilities for her to be a fugitive. They create the possibilities for her to really evade the surveillance of the state because she is a totally indecipherable archival fragment, right? We have no idea, or the state has no idea who she is. So you're really seeing like works in progress here. These are like, welcome to like these gross, dirty, wet prints that I've been working on for a long time. But I've been experimenting lately with what it would mean to abet, right, further Ju Young's escape from the state. What would it mean to sort of further her fugitivity and allow her to escape the surveillance, to escape the archive that attempts to contain her? And so I've been sort of layering her photograph and other women's photographs with a combination of eucalyptus and lye, again, as it appears in the film. These are like parts of the ecosystem of the North San Francisco Bay. And seeing what happens when their photographs are erased and also absorbed. Really interestingly, about the properties of eucalyptus and lye, so this is lye soap, is that lye is both absorbent and corrosive. And so it's doing both at once. And that is exactly, right, the contradiction within the United States' immigration procedures, right? It's both absorptive and corrosive. Asian Americans were both historically incorporated and welcomed into the nation as a form of cheap and imported labor, while simultaneously being legally excluded and restricted from entry. And I think that's all. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention again, they come to you as part of our Woodstock Air Program, which is a 24-year-long residency program that CPW does. We will be announcing the open call in mid-December. So if you have any questions about the process or want to learn how to apply, you can reach out to me at education@cpw.org. Thank you so much.
Take a look at the exhibition that's up. Brenda and Keneally will be doing the artist in the show right now. We'll be doing a talk on the 19th. So